all our viewers to this virtual side event paralleling the 45th UNHRC session. We have very distinguished speakers in our panel today, speaking on the topic of China's weapons of mass subjugation, surveillance, camps, and cultural genocide. I would like to initially apologize that we started 5 minutes late because of the technical issues, but we are very happy to host this side event. Generally, we host side event inside the UN building, but because of the Wuhan originated COVID-19 situation, we have to go live and virtual this time, as well as the last time. So hopefully the next session we will be able to get inside the UN building and discuss. So with regard to the topic, I just wanted to initially give a very brief introduction about the topic. The topic that we have chosen this time is about how China is using certain policies as mass subjugation weapons. For example, surveillance, which forms the basis for arbitrary detention and forced disappearances, all the kind of restrictions on the freedom, and also with regard to the camps. So if you look at the camps, of course, the camps in Xinjiang have become very, very, grabbed the attention of the world, but also, as a camp, I think we have seen the political re-education camp, the legal education camp, the patriotic camps, etc. And also when it comes to cultural genocide, we are also looking at how systematically China is trying to destroy the identity of the so-called ethnic minorities within China. So for our for our speakers, we have Alhadron Tedongla, the director of Tibet Action Institute. We have Jolkun Isa, president of the World Uyghur Congress. Enge Baktu, we have who is the president of the Southern Mongolian Human Rights Information Center, as well as Yang Jilin, who is the president of the People's Initiatives for China. And we have ensured that each of the communities under China who are being suppressed have a voice today at this in this platform, and bring forth what is happening inside China and to the so-called ethnic minorities. So welcome once again to all of you, to all the speakers. Thank you so much for joining us. I would like to start with Hadron Chetonlam. Could you please give us a brief overview of the human rights situation in Tibet, and also specifically with your area of expertise, could you tell us how surveillance is being used as a weapon of mass subjugation?
Great, thank you very much for this opportunity. Can you hear me okay? Great.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you to the Tibet Bureau Geneva, and especially to Tile Chukila for your tireless work on behalf of the Tibetan people and nation, and for the opportunity to speak here today. And thanks to my fellow panel members, all friends I have known and worked alongside for many years now, together as we walk this road seeking justice for our people. I'm here today to tell you about the crisis in Chinese-occupied Tibet and to sound the alarm about the massive scale of repression and human rights abuses taking place there. And when I speak about Tibet, I'm not talking only about the region of central Tibet, which China calls the Tibetan Autonomous Region, or the TAR. Anybody who knows the story of Tibet knows that China has tried to erase the Tibetan nation, along with more than half of the Tibetan people and their lands, by dividing up historical Tibet into the TAR and a dozen mostly majority Tibetan regional districts in the 4 Chinese provinces of Qinghai, Gansu, Sichuan, and Yunnan. So when you hear about Tibet with a population of over 3 million plus people, know that this is incorrect. The speaker or the writer is referring only to the TAR, representing roughly half or a little under half of the actual population of Tibet, and less than half of Tibet's total landmass. So just this past week, thanks to a report by the Jamestown Foundation, the world learned that a massive coercive labor program was being implemented by the Chinese government in central Tibet, or what China has named the Tibetan Autonomous Region. We learned about Tibetans who've been forced to give up their traditional livelihoods as farmers and herders and take part in militarized labor programs where they are trained for low-skilled jobs like those in the manufacturing and service sectors, while at the same time they're subjected to propaganda to, quote, correct their backwards ways of thinking and to learn gratitude for the Chinese Communist Party. In the name of poverty alleviation, these Tibetans are meant to, quote, put down their whip, get out of the pasture, and enter the market, whether they like it or not. According to the Chinese government itself, 500,000 Tibetans were trained as part of this program in the first 7 months of this year alone, with 50,000 having been transferred to jobs within Tibet and at least several thousand sent to work in China. There are even target quotas for each region of the TAR to send workers to China with punishments if they don't meet those quotas. In an op-ed in the New York Times, the Jamestown Report's author, Adrian Zenz, called this, quote, the strongest, most clear and targeted attack on traditional Tibetan livelihoods that we have seen almost since the Cultural Revolution. Almost as shocking as the information in the report is the fact that we didn't know it was happening, or at least we didn't know the scale and the details until now. How could this be? In the 21st century, in this fast-paced information age we're living in, how could we not know that such a monumental and horrendous program is being implemented in Tibet right now? This is because China has effectively cut Tibet off from the world. Few can get in, whether journalists, international observers, government officials, or exile-based Tibetans, and even fewer can get out. Where thousands of Tibetans used to escape on foot every year into Nepal and then India, today almost none make it out. In 2017, 80 Tibetans were reported to have made it. In 2019, I believe a grand total of 18 people are said to have escaped. Tibet has become a high-altitude, high-tech, open-air prison where every person and every square mile, even on the highest windswept mountain passes, is monitored. Through drones and the use of facial recognition technology on the borders, convenience police stations, so-called convenience police stations every 500 meters, neighborhood spies in every village, town, and city, and the surveillance of every person everywhere. Chinese authorities are working overtime to ensure their total control of the Tibetan population. And this attempt at control does not stop at the border. By strictly limiting access to Tibet and using social media tools and apps like WeChat to monitor Tibetans around the world, China is working to coerce and control Tibetans living in exile as well, especially those with family members inside Tibet. But why? What is all of this effort and all of this expense for? The single answer is simple, and it is the same as it has been since China invaded and occupied Tibet 7 decades ago. China wants to destroy Tibetan resistance to Beijing's rule. This is why the Chinese government is hell-bent on eliminating the Tibetan identity. Because just being Tibetan, the very existence of this distinct cultural, religious, and linguistic identity is a threat to the state. Because Tibetans are different, and their loyalty obviously does not lie with the Chinese Communist Party or even China. This could not have been more clear than in 2008, when protests swept across all 3 historical provinces of Tibet and challenged the Chinese government at the moment it mattered most, in the lead up to the Olympic Games in Beijing, when the authorities wanted to ensure there were no signs of instability or dissent anywhere in China. Now, inside Tibet, as we have seen most recently with the mass coerced labor policies, this project to eliminate Tibetan identity is being carried out in every space, in the workplace, in the monasteries, in the schools, on the grasslands, in towns, neighborhoods, and private homes. Children are being denied the right to learn in their mother tongue. Monks and nuns are being denied the right to learn and live in the monasteries. Nomads and farmers are being forced off their lands and forced to live lives they didn't want or ask for. And Tibetans everywhere are being targeted for resisting and being brutalized for daring to organize and to question the authority of the Chinese government to carry out these actions and policies, even under Chinese law. And outside Tibet, China is trying to destroy the Tibetan exile movement and government by choking off the flow of Tibetans from Tibet, who have traditionally filled the Tibetan exile school system and monasteries and given life to the Tibetan political movement. While at the same time, Beijing is working at intimidating overseas Tibetans into stopping their political activities, or worse, through the use of spies and informers, sowing the seeds of discord within Tibetan communities. And of course, the final step, or so Beijing believes, is now to take certain control over the future of Tibet by selecting the next Dalai Lama. Where the Chinese government has tried and failed for 60 years to break the bond between the Tibetan people and the Dalai Lama, they are now working to hijack the institution of the Dalai Lama from future generations of Tibetans by setting in place policies they believe they will need to control the monasteries and to control key Buddhist leaders in Tibet, and by making global declarations about their sole right to choose His Holiness the Dalai Lama's successor. Taken all together, the situation in Tibet, as in East Turkestan, Southern Mongolia, Hong Kong, and China itself, seems bleak. The Chinese government, under Xi Jinping's rule, seems more determined than ever to prevail. But we must not be overwhelmed by this. We must not give in to the belief that they are all-knowing, all-powerful, and that they will succeed. The very foundation of Buddhist belief is the idea of impermanence. All things change. Nothing lasts forever, not even the People's Republic of China. And I believe we are beginning to see the light at the end of this tunnel, finally. It was not that long ago that we Tibetans and all of the groups and people represented here on this panel were told by our own governments and international organizations and institutions around the world that China was changing, that things would get better, that we should understand a rising China was the future, and in fact, market reforms and closer relations with Beijing would certainly lead to freedom and rights and a brighter future for all. But we knew this was wrong. The only thing that mattered to Beijing then, as now, was total dominance in Tibet, in East Turkestan, in all Chinese-controlled territories, and in the world. And now finally, world leaders and all those who told us to wait seem to be waking up to the threat authoritarian China poses to peace and security globally. Now we're starting to see a more clear-eyed understanding of the true nature of the Chinese Communist Party. And as a result, we're starting to see more clear-eyed policies to match that understanding. We're not there yet, but we are getting closer. And as Tibetans have been insisting from the beginning, the key to all of our survival and our success lies in resistance, in standing up and standing firm in the face of Beijing's aggression and repression. World governments, member states of the United Nations, all those concerned in the international community can and should do what we are doing, what all of us on this panel and the people that we represent here are doing. Tibetans, Uyghurs, Southern Mongolians, Chinese, Hong Kongers. We are working together. We are demanding accountability. We are shining light in the darkest places inside China and all of these Chinese-controlled territories and countries. We are challenging and countering China's narratives at every turn. And we are fighting like hell to ensure that our people and our great and ancient traditions and civilizations are not able to be destroyed by the Chinese Communist Party. And we will not give up. And the international community needs to join us. Member states of the United Nations need to sit up and take this seriously and work with us, work together with us, so human rights, truly human rights and freedom prevail in Tibet, in all of our countries, in all of our places, and in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hajun. I think you said what you said, I think, gives a lot of hope and inspiration to all these, all of us who are hoping for change and striving for change and resisting the kind of suppression that is happening, not just inside China, not just inside these regions under China, but also, as you rightly mentioned, the kind of penetration that they are currently having in the communities outside of China as well. Thank you so much, Rajana, for that. Moving on to our next speaker, I would like to request Jolkun Isa, who's the president of the World Uyghur Congress, and also who has been very instrumental in starting this the association of the Uyghurs, and also who has worked for the Uyghur movement since the 1980s, to please give us a holistic approach or a view about what is happening inside Xinjiang region, and also how the Uyghur community is being suppressed, not just in the labor camp, but also who are, even though outside the labor camp, but are also, going through this repression. Over to you, Dolkun.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank for you inviting me speak today on this virtual side event. And it is also nice to see all my old friends, and Ms. Ladon and Enga Batur, Yang Jelly, to use the advantages of the technology. Well, it is also very encouraging to see Tibetans, also Mongolian, Uyghur, and Chinese Democrat friends together to collectively address the human rights catastrophe in China. Chinese Communist Party's horrific persecution for all of community has brought us together. We must be united in solidarity and the cooperation collectively to address these horrific situations that affect us all. The current situation of the Uyghur is dire. The Uyghur community is suffering incredible as the action of the Chinese Communist Party has put very existence of the Uyghur people under threat. Particularly in the almost 4 years alone, Chinese government has subject to the Uyghur people mass arbitrary detention of 3 million innocent Uyghur concentration camp, the largest such a detention since the Second World War. We don't know exactly how many people and still in the concentration camp, but 15th of September, just 2 weeks ago, China issues the white paper on Xinjiang, so-called Xinjiang. They are saying since 2014, each year 1.3 million Uyghur subject to the eradication. It is mean since 2014 until now 6 years, 7.8 million Uyghurs as targeting for the concentration camp, eradication camp. But how many still is a concentration camp? How many is already killed? How many is transferred to the other province in China? How many disappeared? We have no idea. And the mass sterilization of Uyghur women and other post-birth prevention measure in the order to diminish of the Uyghur population. Forced labor and the modern slavery of the 10 or 100,000 of Uyghurs. Attempt to destroy unique Uyghur ethnic identity, forcible assimilate the Uyghur people into Han-centric China. Destruction of the physical representation of the Uyghur identity, including thousands of mosques. And recently, just 2 weeks ago, ASPI, Australian Strategy Policy Institute, issues one very significant report. They are saying since 2017, more than 6,000 most completely destroyed, and another 8,000 partly destroyed. And they destroyed also graveyard and the other site of the religious, cultural, historical importance to the Uyghur people. Ban on the use of Uyghur language in many school and public space. There were religious persecution, including ban of growing of bread, wearing on Islamic dress, and even owning a Quran, forbidden fasting, even forbidden and abandoned some Uyghur the historical Islamic name to the baby as well. Separating Uyghur children from the parents who are detained in the camp to indoctrinate to them to be loyal to the Chinese Communist Party, to the Xi Jinping, and forsake their Uyghur identity. Harassment of the punishment of the Uyghur diaspora and everyone who dare to speak out. And I have a lot of experience on this. I was suffering more than 21 years by the red notes by the Interpol because China blamed me as a terrorist. And also I was detained so many country border. Even today my red notes was delayed 2018, but still I cannot enter so many country. I was detained in the even middle of Europe and Geneva, Frankfurt, and Roma. Last time is Roma 2017. Yeah, all this has taken place in the last couple of years alone. This is a genocide. Everything that is unique about the Uyghur people is under attack. Our language, culture, religion, history, and the ethnic identity. Chinese government is fragmenting also society, imprisoning on the disappearing prominent Uyghur and cutting the social ties between us. CCP is indoctrinating young generation to forsake their ethnicity, religious, cultural, and to only be reality CCP by trying drastically reduce Uyghur birth rate. Chinese government is trying to destroy us physically as a people. CCP is destroying the Uyghur homeland before our very eyes. Uyghur living in the diaspora have had to watch in horror as our culture, language, religious history disappeared. For over the 3 years, we have witnessed for our family members disappear or be forced into the intermittent concentration camp, where they are tortured, brainwashing, and held in a miserable condition. Also, Uyghur women have been sterilized and Uyghur children taken away from the parents or collective sadness in immeasurable. In the last 2 years, I have lost both of my parents under the Chinese CCP's concentration camp. My mother died in the camp in the May 2018, and I learned my father died from the CCP propaganda article attacking me in January 2020. But still, I have no idea which condition, where is my father passed away. Even I don't know his cemetery is. I had not seen either of them over the 20 years. I had not been able to hear their voice again. No, I never will again. I learned one of my brother, my younger brother, older brother was given for long-term prison sentence, and I heard recently the 17-year sentence as a separatism. And my younger brother, he disappeared since 2016. As a member of my family, Turkestan has been forced to denounce me in the CCP propaganda video. I cannot convey the pain and the sadness in my heart, but we cannot stop while millions of Uyghurs are suffering. Each of the Uyghurs detained in the camp, forced labor facility, prisoners, and who are sterilized and persecuted for their ethnicity, religion, and culture, and each one of them human being with family and friends who miss them. There are no millions of strategy of the Uyghur community no. Many families have similar stories of loss of to my own. We are people united, grief for what China is doing to us in Turkestan. We are also unified with slow the stops the ongoing genocide and the save of friends, of family, and the Uyghur people as a whole. Future of the Uyghur people is at stake. If nothing is done, Uyghurs are as a unique ethnic group may be disappeared completely. Yet, response of the international community has not met severity and the urgency of the situation. In all the 3 years, there has been no resolution, agenda item or special section of the UN Human Rights Council. Despite it being a genocide and one of the most serious human rights situations in the world today, UN Secretary General has barely mentioned the Uyghur crisis, ignoring an ongoing genocide. United States is only the country to take real concrete action to address this crisis. We appreciate EU for repeatedly raising the crisis, but there is a desperate need for more robust and meaningful approach. The Muslim world has remained shamefully silent on this issue. World cannot sit back while a genocide occurs. China must be held accountable. We cannot continue to have normal relations with government actively committing genocide and other atrocity. However, all people in China are under threat. We have expressed the varying degrees of assimilating the repression for decades. Tibet, Southern Mongolia, Hong Kong, and other areas as well, occupants with this horrific treatment. For years, we have been stuck in a feedback loop of repression, atrocity again, one of us then imposed on the others. Southern Mongolia, we are among the first experience sort of cultural genocide that Uyghur and Tibet are now experiencing. No language bans first test on the Uyghur and Tibet and being used against Southern Mongolian by Chinese government. Current CCP party secretary of Turkestan, Chen Chiangko, first tested his repressive security measure to quash Tibetan dissident and use this technique on the Uyghurs. No repressive security and surveillance technology tested on the Uyghurs in being exported to Hong Kong, Tibet, and around the world. Post-labor camps and the political indoctrination used against Uyghur are now being forced on the Tibetan people. All repression is linked and overlapping. TCP atrocities have intertwined on the fates of all people. Therefore, we must be united, work together to stop this atrocity. What happening to our community can and is really already spreading around the world. The Chinese government and its allies are undermining concept of human rights in the UN and challenging our international order. Chinese Communist Party harass and intimidate Uyghur, Tibet, Hong Kong, Southern Mongolia, and even outside of China. It continues exert its influence over the UN body and institution. If we and the wider international community fails to act, there will be no safe place for the Uyghur, Tibet, Hong Kong, Southern Mongolia, and all other who call their basic right and the freedom in China. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dolkun. Especially thank you for also explaining from your own perspective as well as your own experiences of the kind of suppression, the kind of information blockade that even you could not, attend your parents' funeral, as well as not even having the information about their death. I think that paints a very, very grave picture about what is happening inside the labor camps as well as within the so-called Xinjiang Autonomous Region. Thank you so much, Dolkun. Before I move on to the next speaker, I just wanted to inform our viewers that we will be accepting live questions to our panelists. So please feel free to, comment in the comment section of the Tibettv Facebook page, and we will address your questions to the panelists. So moving on to our next speakers, I think Dolkun set the right pace by saying that what has happened in Tibet and Xinjiang or the East Turkestan is currently happening in Inner Mongolia, or what the Mongolians call as Southern Mongolia. And the current rise of protests that have occurred. I was just talking to Enke Batula before going live about the number of suicides that are happening as a mark of protest against these repressive policies. So I would now like to call upon Enke Batula to please give us this information, and also give us an overview about what is happening in the southern Mongolia, as well as the kind of protests that have ensued. Over to you, Enke Batula.
Okay, you hear me? Okay. Good morning, and good evening, and good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank Geneva Tibet Bureau Human Rights Desk for organizing this panel discussion and inviting us to discuss the issues and problems we are facing in our respective nations. From Southern Mongolian perspective, what's happening in Southern Mongolia is a cultural genocide carried out by the Chinese authorities under the direct instruction from Beijing. The official euphemism of this new round of cultural genocide is called second generation bilingual education, which in practice is a monolingual education policy aiming at the complete eradication of Mongolian language from the entire educational system in Southern Mongolia. In the early June this year, a high-ranking official from the Chinese Ministry of Education visited Southern Mongolia and verbally communicated the central government's decision to the local educational bureaus and school authorities. What really concerned the Southern Mongolians more was the way the policy was implemented, the total secrecy and of the plan and the surreptitious way of the policy being carried out. Even until today, there has been no single official document from the Chinese central government on this so-called major national strategic deployment. So in response to this renewed attack on the Mongolian culture, the entire Southern Mongolian population has risen up. Starting the late August, a region-wide civil disobedience resistance movement has taken place across Southern Mongolia. From kindergartners to top intellectuals, from middle schoolers to college students, from ordinary herders to rural villagers and farmers, from musicians and artists to taxi drivers, from government officials to party members, even some Mongolian police. All people from all walks of life in Southern Mongolia have rejected this new round of cultural genocide. And then almost all Mongolian schools and classrooms were empty as the new semester started on September 1st. Despite the government push for early registration, police intimidation, and official propaganda, the Mongolian parents organized themselves to launch a total school boycott. Many parents proposed homeschooling, and others even proposed a synchronized region-wide demonstration in major cities across Southern Mongolia. At least 300,000 students joined the school boycott. According to some analysts, this protest is the largest mass movement in mainland China since 1989 student movement. The level of coordination and solidarity is unprecedented. Not only the entire Southern Mongolian population took part in the protest one way or another, but also the Mongolians around the world, including the citizens of independent country of Mongolia, the Kalmyk, Buryat, Hazara, and the overseas Mongolian communities have been staging protests in front of Chinese embassies and consulates in their respective countries to show their solidarity to the Southern Mongolians on the ground. The Chinese authorities' response to this massive civil disobedience resistance movement is a very typical one. and brutal and inhuman crackdown. Mass arrest and arbitrary detentions are always the first step of the crackdown. We estimate at least 4,000 to 5,000 Southern Mongolians have been arrested, detained, or placed under house arrest since late August. In addition to this, the other method of intimidation include like firing people from jobs, removing officials from position, expelling and blacklisting students, suspending herders, social benefits, denying access, denying people from having access to bank loans, and even confiscation of property for their refusal to cooperate with the authorities. So under this inhuman intimidation and pressure, at least 11 Mongolians lost their life in the past month. So this is pretty much the quick summary of what had happened in Southern Mongolia in the past 1 month. The major news media around the world have been extensively covering this moment, and then most of them called this moment as a rare protest. In fact, the protests are never rare in Southern Mongolia. Only 9 years ago, there was another large-scale protest sparked by the brutal killing of a Mongolian herder by a Chinese coal mining truck. During the past 9 years alone, hundreds of smaller-scale protests have taken place across Southern Mongolia, especially in the rural areas, in protest of China's mining and land grab and environmental destruction. So regarding this new round of cultural genocide, or so-called the second generation bilingual education, it is not actually a surprise to the Southern Mongolians, because genocide and this form of eradication of culture has always been the integral part of China's ethnic policy towards Southern Mongolia in the past 71 years. So to us, this cultural genocide is the second genocide, major genocide. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Chinese government committed a physical genocide against the entire Mongolian population, and at least 100,000 Mongolians were killed and 500,000 persecuted. Of course, all Mongolian schools were banned during that time, and after the this genocide was concluded, some Mongolian schools were restored, but again, starting in early 2000, the majority of the rural schools were again either being removed or converted to Chinese ones under the so-called policies of ecological migration and urbanization. So according to some statistics, the number of students taught in Mongolian has been reduced by 80% already since the 1980s. So what we are talking about today is the complete removal of the remaining 20% of what we had in the 1980s. So that's why many Mongolians consider this as a final blow to Mongolian language, and Mongolian culture as a whole. Because if we lose our language, we have nothing else to lose. We have already lost our national independence. We have lost our political autonomy. We have lost our traditional way of life, and our environment is destroyed. And the language is the last stronghold of our national identity. So in this sense, this battle is the last battle, a battle of survival, a battle of existence. If we lose this battle, we will cease to exist as a distinct people. But I believe Southern Mongolians will continue to fight until they are free from any form of Chinese control. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Inge Batula, for giving those sweeping remarks on how China is systematically trying to suppress the identity and the cultural rights of the Southern Mongolians, and also telling us about how the protests in Southern Mongolia has been not just the rare, as you said, but also has been very periodic, and people have been striving for these, and also that this battle is battle for survival. I think that paints the most grave picture that can be painted, especially when it comes to human rights situation inside China. Thank you so much, Enkepatula, for that. We have seen how the ethnic minorities designated by China are being systematically isolated and also suppressed by the Chinese Communist Party. I think it is very important to now understand that even within China, be it the human rights defenders or the pro-democracy activists or even the Hong Kongers, to a large extent are being suppressed and their freedoms and rights are being violated. And I think no other person would be able to paint the current scenario inside China, the mainland China, as well as Hong Kong, than Yang Jilin, our next speaker. He is the president of the People's Initiatives for China, and also he has been one of the most vocal pro-democracy speakers. He was part of the Tiananmen Square massacre, and also when he returned to China to pay visit and respects to his father's grave, was detained incommunicado, and after a strong rallying by the Howard University, his alma mater, as well as from the President Bush himself, finally Yang Jilin was able to come out of China and was released on the condition that he may never return. Over to you, Yang Jilin. Please tell us how the pro-democracy activists, the mainland Chinese, the human rights defenders are being systematically suppressed and are being ensured that they don't raise their voice again. Over to you, Yang Jilin.
Thank you, Finley Lot, for putting together this very important panel. And my fellow panelists, dear friends, good day. The human rights situation under China has undoubtedly reached its worst in 30 years. It's very challenging for me to summarize the overall situation in China in just a few minutes. What I want to tell you is the civil society space in China has been squeezed to zero. And my panelists have just shared with you the atrocities that CCP is perpetrating on their respective groups. The 21st century concentration camps, forced labors, unveiling massive surveillance on people. And there's the cultural genocide of Uyghurs and the Tibetans, and now this is expanding to those living in southern Mongolia, the Mongolians living in southern Mongolia. There is a political, cultural genocide on the people of Hong Kong, sinicization of religions, military intimidation to Taiwan, and the list goes on. All horror stories. These stories are making international headlines, which is good, but it's not enough. We know some countries, especially United States, has recently taken very important steps to address the atrocities that is happening in Xinjiang region, Tibet, but still we see there's no space actually in China, under China, for any viable opposition. So I think this now we are facing a very difficult question, is how we can help those inside and under China to build a viable opposition. I believe this is necessary in order to change the situation for the better. Opportunities often present themselves as small cracks in China's dictatorial regime. We must unite, work to create divisions in the CCP regime. In order to have a viable opposition under China, we must have some space. We have to press China to open space. In order to have open space, we probably first have to press the regime to open up, namely creating a division in the CCP regime leadership. To that end, today, instead of repeating the stories we are familiar with, I would like to propose 3 joint actions, 3 possible solutions to press the regime open. In short, they are: number 1, advocate for the world democracies to come together to hold the CCP accountable for COVID-19. Number 2, advocate for the world democracies to establish formal diplomatic ties with the democracy. Number 3, advocate for a human rights NATO. Let me explain each with some details. Number 1, advocate for the world democracies to come together to hold the CCP accountable for COVID-19. Recently, our organization, Citizen Power Initiatives for China, produced a comprehensive report called Examining China's Response to the COVID-19 Outbreak, September 2019 to January 2020, the catastrophe that could have been avoided, which documents how the CCP responded to the virus, especially day by day in the critical month between December 26, 2019 and January 25th, 2020. 6 key conclusions have emerged in the course of this research. 1, the COVID-19 epidemic could have been stopped in early stage. 2, the top priority of the CCP was to maintain social stability, i.e., its own control at all costs. Number 3, the Chinese government deliberately suppressed information about the source and extent of the outbreak. Number 4, the Chinese government deliberately downplayed the threat of the epidemic. 5, the Chinese government deliberately misled the international community. Number 6, Chinese President Xi Jinping is the principal culprit. There are 4 main reasons why the world must hold the CCP accountable for COVID-19, which has taken more than 1 million lives yesterday. 1 reason is morality. And number 2, global governance. That has a lot to do with the human rights issue. Number 3, protecting against the next deadly pathogen. And number 4, we can use this strategy to press the CCP regime open. There is already undercurrent opposing CCP for exactly the same reason. So I don't have time to go into details. I move to the second action suggestion. Number 2, advocate for democratic nations to establish a formal diplomatic ties with democratic Taiwan. We need to strengthen Taiwan. Taiwan is the shining democracy which deserves the international recognition. In responding to COVID-19 and helping others in this crisis, Taiwan has shown the world it is a responsible, capable, and trustworthy partner. And world democracies must let the CCP and other world dictators, for that matter, understand civilization and not barbarism will prevail. The strategy to recognize Taiwan has a great potential to help split the CCP leadership, setting in motion a big internal fight in the party, set a wedge between the Chinese hyper-nationalists and the CCP leader, and embolden our liberal democratic colleagues under China, including Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongolians, and Hong Kong. I said this based on my understanding of China's politics, as it is deeply rooted in the Chinese traditional worldview, Middle Kingdom, imperial heaven. No ruler can afford to lose Taiwan. I move to the number 3. And thirdly, advocate for the world democracy to come together to form a human rights NATO. I think you all agree with me that democracies need to unite and confront China together on human rights more effectively and strongly. A new idea would be to advocate for democratic nations to put together and form a human rights NATO. A human rights NATO that will engage in both collective confrontation and collective defense on issues pertaining to human rights. At the moment, there are a lot of talk of democracy being on recess. If this is true, one of the major reasons is because democratic values routinely gave way to economic interests. A NATO for human rights, which I foresee is a treaty-based, would help turn this trend around. It would preserve democratic values while protecting economic interests. At a later time, I may have an opportunity to expand on these ideas of collective confrontation and collective defense. These ideas, I believe, are truly concepts which translate into effective actions. The CCP thinks not in days, weeks, or years, but in tens of years, hundreds of years. We need to do the same in our campaign, but at the same time, put all our energies into producing cracks in the CCP and start breaking up their long-term game. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yang Janila, for that solution-based presentation that you gave, and also specifying that how China thinks not in terms of days or weeks or months, but in terms of hundreds of years ahead, and how it kind of gets into this systematically ensuring that people cannot raise voice in many areas, including, as you said, even in Taiwan. Thank you so much, Yang Jalinla, for that presentation. I would like to once again remind our viewers that we have the comment section open, so please feel free to pose your questions. So far, I see that we have received a lot of questions, but before I go to the comment section, I would want to pose one common question to all the panelists. So the common thread that I see from each of your presentation and your talk is that when it comes to China, it has implemented and perfected a lot of policies of suppression, and it is also ensuring that these policies are replicated in other occupied regions. And so for that, as Hajunla started with the report on from the Jamestown Foundation by Adrian Zenz, I think if you look at that report also, it draws the comparative narrative of how the entire aim of these camps seem to be that removing or diluting the identity of the people, and also ensuring that they are sort of, there's some sort of loyalty that is built in these people. So having known that now, what do you think would be the best way going ahead when we look about ensuring that there is more a united struggle for these human rights issues? And I would also couple it with one of the audience's question, Mr. Rinzin Wangchukla, who is saying that what are the best solution to protect our cultural language from repression of PRC on international level? So I think these questions are kind of very similar. So I will request each of the panelists to give your inputs and thoughts on these. Can I start with Hadrila?
Sure. I mean, I think, well, one of the things that we have to do is work together and tell this story together. So all of our individual stories, as we are doing now, tell it together so that that it is clear, because I don't think it is to many people. And I think one of the key strategies to deal with China is to have multilateral action. So the Chinese government will sit up and take notice if multiple countries, democracies, come together and take action. This has happened in the past in terms of co-authoring letters or having ambassadors of various nations, the Canadians, the Germans, the Americans, working together on this or that initiative to speak out against the Chinese leadership. But I think we need to go a step further, and I think all evidence points to the fact that more serious action is needed. And what we have long been saying is multilateral action, democratic nations, some handful stand together, form a contact group, form a body that will work and act together to address some of these key issues. The Chinese government does not want to see coordination on the international stage. And of course, that's why they work so hard to ensure the United Nations is not a place that is effective in advocating for any of our issues or any of our people. But in terms of getting their attention, signaling to Beijing that these international governments mean business, and focusing them in on a couple of key areas that are a cause for international alarm and concern and will be jointly addressed in whatever way and tools, diplomatic and otherwise, that free and democratic nations have in dealing with China. Beijing will be laser focused on what is it that is of international concern, what are, where are movements, where the persecution and the repression intersects. They will be forced to respond, and they will, I think they've so effectively over the last 2-3 decades demobilized any kind of joint international action. I think that in a way they expect that will just remain, and it's why they jump up and down every single time they see any kind of one nation or government or a coordinated letter on any of our key issues. But those are sort of one-off. It's usually as a response to this or that development in China and lawyers crackdown, or in Tibet, or I'm saying joint multilateral action contact group created to address some very specific priority areas, starting with this, this cultural identity and elimination project that they're engaged in all of our homelands.
Thank you, Hajrullah. Jolkun, would you want to step in? you're mute.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree, Ladan. Yes, so it is first all we have Tibetan, Southern Mongolian, and East Turkestan. We have all sharing same experience. Chinese government CCP testing one things start one area, then expanded some other area. For example, for civilian technology system, Chinese government CCP testing East Turkestan for the Uyghur, then this and the use to Tibetan, Southern Mongolia, other part of China, even today is export some other world, more than 20 countries to import Chinese civilian face recognition, voice recognition technology. And internally, and also Chinese government, the Xinjiang, who was a party secretary, was Tibet, he testing for the eradication in Tibet. Then and the hardly use and this eradication, then and the set up the concentration camps coming to this level. And the forbidden Uyghur language first, then and the step by step coming to the Tibet, then in the Southern Mongolia today. So that's why Chinese government CCP intention is the aim very clearly, just assimilated Tibetan, Mongol, Uyghur. CCP never accepts this diversity, never accept different of religion, different of identity, different of culture. Just one today is Chinese government is concentrated firstly to renounce national and religious identity, saying you are being Chinese or you have to be killing. This is the strategy of the CCP. That's why, and the whole in the today for the globally, United States really focusing and they really take concrete action against the CCP. Some high-level Chinese Communist Party high-level official in the East Turkestan, Xinjiang, Zhu Heiliang was sanctioned, and the Bing Tuan was sanctioned, and also more than 50 company also puts a blacklist. But just the U.S. cannot do success alone. Should be set up coalition, international coalition. Should be and encourage some other, particularly democratic nation, European countries. Still in the European country also not coming same voice, different of voice, split, because Chinese government trying to undermine European Union as well. So we all the time we write this. This is also dangerous for the European Union and the united European Union as well. Chinese government now is use the win-win diplomacy and trying to split the European Union as well. So and the United States must be set up coalition, some other European country, and getting strong voice, and it will be stop this atrocity inside also. And today we know is what's going on in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is autonomy is over already. Yes, after national security law implemented already. Now it's Hong Kong's activist is. So just before this panel, I'm attending same panel is the German Bundestag. Zhou Wang. He speak by the video. He go to the court tomorrow. He has a court tomorrow. What will be happening? We don't know. Maybe we will be sentenced. Yeah, this is the situation. So whole the world should be wake up. But unfortunately, most of some countries today continue make business with China. You know, business should not be as usual today. And because today's most of some Western countries should have some responsibility, because this country, United States, European country, provide technology and pays the money for gives a loan to the China CCP. Then China coming today is this level, and the second big power, economic power. 20-30 years ago, China CCP take a little bit caution for the international pressure. Some other countries today, China say no. Just to 25th, 26th of September. 2 days ago, Xinjiang conference was held in Beijing. Xi Jinping and made a statement. We saw on his statement, he never changed policy towards the Uyghur, Xinjiang. He continued repression policy. Yeah, so that's why in the international should set up the coalition, and inside also we and the Tibetan, Uyghur, Mongol, and the Hong Kongers and the Chinese democratic movement, we have to more cooperate together internationally. This is the only way I can stop this atrocity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dolkun. Inge Batula?
Yes, I totally agree with Ladon and Brother Dolkun about how to effectively fight Chinese, well, the domestic human rights violation and international hegemony, global hegemony. So the best way and then best hope is international pressure, because China is domestically it's just is not going to listen to the people at all. So international pressure is a hope, and now the world is somehow waking up, especially in the United States. They seem to have learned the bitter lesson of allowing China to have unrestricted access to all of their financial resources, and then all these global financial resources. So I think it's really important for the democratic country, free world, to rise up. As Dolkun mentioned, it's, you know, the free world, especially the United States and the European Union, really failed to act in the past 2-3 decades. There was certain window opportunity, like especially right after the 1989, the West should have taken some action, immediate action, but the approach by the especially United States and European countries are like sort of soft approach, and hoping that China will become gradually democratic, which turned out not to be the case. So in this sense, we have to say that China is actually the Frankenstein of the West, and then United States. I mean, they were allowing China to become this kind of more authoritarian regime, and so. But it's not it's not too late. I mean, you can take some action, and especially here in the United States, the policy toward China is really shifting dramatically, and hope this is going to continue. So that way, there is hope for these nations, occupied nations like Southern Mongolia, Tibet, and East Turkestan, as well as Chinese citizens, like 1.5 billion citizens are under this authoritarian regime. So for us, the exile organization, we are pretty much all exile organizations. So we have no access, there's no possibility for us to directly have any activities within our countries, within the borders of China. So I think yeah, the coordinated actions like this, the raising awareness and pressuring international committees is one way to fight the Chinese communist regime.
Thank you, Inge Batula. Yang Zilinla?
No question is easy facing China. And as far as cultural identity concerns, I think there's no doubt the CCP is making every effort to make China a language hegemon as a part of to keep the CCP in power, make China 100 years or even longer empire. And so the CCP and its leader Xi Jinping is so determined on this trajectory. And there's a little space that we can maneuver anything inside. Internationally, I think there are a lot of things we can do for the groups that concerned, the concerned groups, the Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Mongolians. I strongly suggest that you set up an individual or joint culture project in the international community, promoting your original language, your native language writing, to promote your art, literature, and music. Each of you have a beautiful literature, music, and arts that I know a lot of them. But the international recognition of these literature, culture, and music arts actually is very low. So we have to make effort to enhance international recognition of these valuable cultures and promote the specific writers, musicians, and artists to introduce them to the international community for various world competition, Nobel Peace Literature, for example. And, to do this kind of culture projects. If, for example, a Tibetan writer or Mongolian writer or Uyghur writer won the Nobel Literature Prize, and that will in turn encourage the people back home to keep the language and keep writing in the language. So that's the least thing we can do and we should do. And that's my suggestion, very specific suggestion. And when it comes to multilateralism, I have very about it. And in the past 30 years, there are a lot of failures about multilateralism. The Human Rights Council is the noted example. And European Union now is less than satisfactory. For that reason, many people actually have forsaken the materialism and go to the unilateralism, hoping that strong leaders in democracies can play a more important role. So I don't think it's a good idea to abandon multilateralism altogether, but we have to have a new thing. I don't think UN Human Rights Council model is something we should follow. That is why I propose a human rights NATO, which is not, people just come together lightly. I propose a treaty based organization, international organization, copying NATO, the current NATO. When it comes to multilateralism, I think NATO has been one of the most successful examples. Though this is a treaty-based, each signatory country impledes a human rights act. That's law. Each one should pass a law and linking human rights to all fields of its diplomatic ties with dictatorships. China, for example. And that includes regular assessments and executive report to its parliament or Congress. And member states of NATO should collectively confront human rights violators. If they decide to confront, they confront together on the specific issues. For example, the concentration camp in Xinjiang. They should have come together to do the same thing. And then the member states should agree unified means of dealing with individual instances of human rights violations via economic sanctions, boycotting international cultural events, exchanges games, Olympic Games in 2022, for example, and so on and so forth. And collective defense, by which I mean, for example, when Liu Xiaobo was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and China retaliated against Norway. The question is how much the country like Norway, not a big country, can sacrifice for taking strong stand against China. So probably very limited. So how to resolve this issue? The answer is come together. When one member country attacked by China economically, the other countries come to rescue. So this is the basic idea of collective defense that will help break the dilemma of collective action that all democracy have been so far trapped in. So that's what I strongly advocate now. And another thing that concerns me so much is how to create a space in China. We all know domestically it's almost impossible to do anything meaningful now under Xi Jinping. But there's undercurrent. The recent case of Ren Zhiqiang, who was sentenced to 18 years, is a very good example. He's the second generation of the Chinese Communist revolutionary, and has a very strong influence among people like him, the elite in the party. Because of COVID-19, he came up to openly criticize Xi Jinping, calling him a clown and a clown without clothes. They got punished, sentenced to 18 years in prison. So that example shows that there are many people within the party who actually do not like Xi Jinping, want to crack open, but they are waiting for opportunity to come together, to form a viable opposition inside the party first, then extend to the entire society. So we have to help them to create that kind of opportunity. I think COVID-19 is one issue. Taiwan is another issue. We all worried about China's hyper-nationalist sentiment that has been mobilized successfully by CCP to help it implement policies in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Southern Mongolia, these regions, and Hong Kong and Taiwan. But the nationalists have now become a major source of legitimacy of the CCP's rule in China, and it has become a super political correctness. And at the same time, it has become CCP's Achilles heel, if you will. If we attack that point, then we will have opportunity. That is why I advocate for the world democracy to recognize Taiwan.
Thank you so much, Yang Jilinla. That was very, very comprehensive and strategic points that you mentioned. We don't have much time, but I just want to pose another common question to all the panelists, and this is specifically also coming from one of our viewer called Pebapu, which in Tibetan basically means Tibetan boy. So his question is related to Belt and Road Initiative, and I would want to take that into my next question. That is, we have seen this export of policies of, suppression within China, from Tibet to East Turkestan to Southern Mongolia to Hong Kong. But we are also witnessing this export of dependency policy, whereby, for example, in the Jamestown Foundation report, it clearly shows how the so-called poverty alleviation plans are basically strategic maneuvers of the CCP to ensure that the Tibetans who traditionally led a self-sufficient and sustainable lifestyle are made to depend on the party for welfare benefits, and thereby controlling these people. I think similarly it has been done for the Uyghurs in southern Mongolia, and it might eventually come to Hong Kong as well. But it is already come to the international community. Look at the Belt and Road Initiative. Look at how the companies, the countries with huge business transactions with China are being made to depend on them first and then control their politics and the government. So I just want to quickly ask you your thoughts on this, as well as what do you think about Chinese candidacy to the UNHRC Council? Because I think China has, given its voluntary pledge about protecting and promoting human rights. But when it comes to human rights, China has again always depended on characterizing it as human rights with Chinese characteristics. So I think these two are very related on how China is using its business, its donations to the UN to control the system, to control the countries, make it dependent on China as it has done for its so-called ethnic minorities. Quickly, your thoughts, please, on this, and please make it as brief as possible so that we can wind up on time. Maybe we should start with, please go ahead.
Okay, so I think this is very simple. It's a Chinese colonialism, a neo-colonialism, and then it's a part of China's global hegemony. It's exactly the same pattern that the Chinese government used in southern Mongolia, Tibet, and East Turkestan 70 years ago. When they came to our land, they were helping us, they were developing us. Now they are exactly using the exact same strategy in rest of the world. But one thing they are underestimating is that they think their money is omnipotent, all powerful, but that's not the case. People will rise up, people will fight back, and then they always thinking if they have money, they can do everything, which is not the case. I mean, yes, at some degree, yes, their money work, but not always. Thank you.
Jolkun, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. Well, very quickly, I can say is that Chinese government, CCP, use its power to manipulate the UN human rights system. No, it is, I can say very, very openly, very directly, frankly, UN human rights system is very corrupted now. Yes, because China uses its money and trying to stop and trying to control whole the UN human rights system. Not only United Nations Human Rights Council, and also China trying to control Interpol. Use the Interpol and fighting its opposition voice. You know, I am the clearly example of one of them. I was suffering 21 years because of the red notes. Yeah, by the Interpol. And also we see WHO, World Health Organization. And because of the Chinese government, actually CCP not fighting against the COVID-19. Chinese government fighting against the truth. If Chinese government shares the information on time internationally, maybe less people died today. But as a result, so many people died. And the WHO and the Chinese CCP cooperate each other. Because why? China gives the money and the control everywhere. So if China is continue being the elected member of the Human Rights Council, it is a big shame and the big stand of the Human Rights Council. This is my short view.
Yang Jilinla, do you want to step in? Please make it brief. I'm sorry to interrupt that.
Oh, yes, UN Human Rights Council is a total failure. The only use for us to use the platform to name and shame, that's all. And other than that, there's no function at all. And Dawkins, as I just mentioned, the WHO, this is just another example. China has made inroads in the international organizations with money, mainly with money. We have to have a way to stop it. If we cannot save UN Human Rights Council, for example, we should form a new one, a functional one, effective one. That is why I'm advocating for a human rights NATO.
Thank you, Yang Jilinla. Alhajullah?
Yeah, I mean, I just to go back to the question about China's new colonialism, I do agree that, in the end, it's not just the money that counts. And the way that the Chinese government has behaved in Latin America and in Africa and countries all over the world now with debt trap diplomacy and these, terribly ill thought through um, large infrastructure projects and whatnot. The people are in many places seeing the reality. Often it's the government that holds them back, but the people know the true nature of Chinese so-called investment in their lands and the true intention of these gifts, so-called gifts that China is going around distributing in the world. And I think that we're already seeing, especially with some of the mass diplomacy, there's sort of unprecedented backlash in countries in Africa for the Chinese government's flawed rollout of their faulty PPE and other gifts that they have given. And I feel like we have to, on the one hand, have more faith in people around the world. There's already a backlash against this kind of new colonialism from China. I think we need to push for greater understanding of what their intentions and designs are in the world. And I think we've talked, some of us have talked for a long time about a Connect the Dots campaign where we, have a way to link all these places in the world with that China is, engaged in resource exploitation or labor exploitation, you name it. And to connect those dots back to our stories. In particular, I think our common stories right here could do a great deal in terms of educating people and governments as to the reality of this, new colonialism from China. I just don't think we should underestimate the new awakening that we're seeing on the international stage right now. Just a few years ago, really, some of this coordinated, upsetted action and governments speaking out against China, this would have seemed almost impossible. Suddenly, in a way, not fast enough for us, but suddenly things have changed. The tide has turned. It's not just going to be Trump administration, Republican-led resistance against China. I think we're going to see this will be a threat. This is bipartisan here in the United States. This is a threat that is going to just get stronger and run through people of all stripes and persuasions and parties and political backgrounds globally. I think the Chinese Communist Party's luck is running out, and I think their true face is being known and understood. And that's a good thing for all of us, and it's our job to keep shining the light and not just raising awareness and education, but calling for concrete action and coordinated global action with real results, with real sanctions, with a real cost on the Chinese leadership.
Thank you, Lajunla. I will give each of the speakers very few seconds to just wrap up your talk on, firstly, I think your message to people back home who are looking to the free world for some kind of reassurance, I guess, that their voices are being heard. So what would you want to say to your people back home? And also, what would be your message to the UN, to the countries, to the various, international organizations who are, as rightly said, waking up now? What would be your message for them? So very briefly, I would like to go with the reverse order of our initial speakers list. So I'll start with Yang Jilinla. Yang Jilinla, your voice is muted.
Okay. Thank you again, Felila, for this important panel. I think it's very good for our come together on the regular basis to analyze the situation on the ground, and more importantly, to come up with joint action plan. And we, the Chinese dissident human rights activists, will continue to work with our Tibetan brothers, Uyghur brothers, Mongolian brothers, not only for our rights, but for the right of everybody. And I think not only those people under China, but those neighboring countries are under threat. And the entire world is under threat of China. So we have to continue to work with international community and educating international community about the nature of the CCP and advocate for actions the international community should come up with, not only for the sake of the people under the rule of China, but also for their own interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Young Jalinla. Inge Patula?
Okay, my message to my people is keep fighting, never give up. You are not alone. Our Tibetan and Uyghurs and Hong Kongers, Taiwanese friends are also on our side, and the whole world is on our side. We will be free one day, and Southern Mongolia, Tibet, and East Turkestan will be free one day, and then Chinese people will enjoy democracy in the future.
Thank you. Jolkun?
Chris, thank you so much for hosting this side event, very significant. And I would like to say we all have only one common enemy. It is the Chinese Communist Party. So that's why we are all suffering by the Chinese Communist Party. Tibet, Uyghur, Mongol, Chinese people, and the Hong Kong, Taiwan, all. So we have to unite it. And I would like to say all this Uyghur people and all the people, we should never lose of hope. We believe one day we will be success. Communistic regime, dictator regime, never forever. We have seen whole human beings witnessed so many dictatorships so far. Nasser regime. I believe that one day CCP will be gone, so we all be being free people. So and never lost hope. We continue fighting for our right.
Thank you, Jolkunla. Hajunla?
Yes, thank you so much for organizing this and for including me. My message is the same to Tibetans inside Tibet. We hear your voices, despite everything they do to try to silence you. We see your suffering and your pain, despite all they've done to try to hide you and hide the atrocities from the world. And we are with you, and we will never stop. An entirely new generation of Tibetans born and raised in foreign lands, even if we speak foreign languages, we are Tibetan, and we have not forgotten Tibet. We have not forgotten you, and we will do whatever we can to continue this fight for as long as it takes until we realize our freedom and our independence. And we believe that it's coming, and we take our lead and our inspiration from you, Tibetans inside, and we will never give up.
Thank you so much, Hajunla. From Tibet Bureau Geneva, I would like to thank each of the panelists for agreeing to come here, and for that last very emotional but strong messages from each one of you, that back home, please believe that we hear you, that we have not forgotten you, and that we will continue to amplify your voices in every international fora that we get opportunity, and in every other possible ways to ensure that someday the freedoms, the basic human rights are restored, and that people back home, the Southern Mongolians, the Uyghurs, the Hong Kongers, the mainland Chinese, and the Tibetans are able to live in dignity and be recognized as human beings again, and treated with respect. So thank you so much. Thank you all our viewers to joining us. Thanks, my special thanks to Tibet TV team for helping us with the live streaming. So thank you all. Wish you all the best, and keep fighting, I say. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.